I still remember the sound of the door slamming behind me. The cold night felt like knives against my skin. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coat closed. My husband didn't care. He didn't even look back. I walked down that silent street with nothing. No warmth, no direction, no idea what I would do next. Then a black SUV slowed beside me. The window rolled down, and the voice I heard changed everything. When he slammed the door behind me that night, I stood there stunned as the cold air wrapped around my skin like a punishment I never earned and yet had learned to expect after years of surviving inside a home that felt more like a battlefield than a sanctuary. I had forgotten what it felt like to stand on my own 2 feet without fear pressing down on my chest. I could still hear the echo of his voice, the sharp tone, the dismissive sigh, the way he always spoke as if my existence was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. I had spent so long trying to convince myself that if I just tried harder, if I just stayed quiet, if I just swallowed my tears, he might soften, he might love me, he might look at me the way a husband should look at a wife. But standing there in the freezing dark, I realized none of that had ever been possible, because love was never something he offered and survival was never something I should have mistaken for affection. As the wind hit my face, I felt a strange mix of pain and relief swirling inside me. My heart was hurting, yes, but buried under all the shaking and fear was a tiny spark of clarity I had ignored for far too long. I had spent years believing I was the problem, believing that if something went wrong it had to be my fault. Maybe I made dinner too late, maybe I spoke too soft or too loud, maybe I did not look pretty enough or patient enough, maybe I was not the wife he wanted in that house. Every mistake was mine, every fault was mine, every disappointment was mine, and I wore that guilt the way other people wore jewelry, heavy and always visible. But the moment he pushed me out into the night, I felt something shift. For the first time in years I was outside his walls, outside his shadow, outside the version of me he had shaped with insults and silence. I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking mostly from the cold but also from the shock of what had just happened. One moment I was inside a house that was supposed to be my home, and the next I was standing on the sidewalk like a stranger to my own life. As I took my first steps away from that place, I noticed how loud the world felt. The sound of distant cars, the rustle of dry leaves, the hum of streetlights felt almost overwhelming, because I had spent so long in a life where silence was enforced and noise only existed when he was angry. The cold air burned my lungs, and every breath reminded me that I was still here, still alive, still human, even if he had spent years making me feel otherwise. I looked at the house behind me and it hit me like a wave. I had been begging for warmth in a place that only ever gave me frost. I had been asking for softness in a place that only delivered edges. I had been praying for peace in a place that fed on tension. I started walking without knowing where I was going. My steps were slow, uneven, almost hesitant, as if my body still expected him to come storming out and drag me back inside, but he never did. He did not care if I froze out there, he did not care if I fell, he did not care at all, and somehow that reality hurt more than the door slamming in my face. Every part of me felt raw, as if years of suppressed hurt were rushing to the surface all at once. I remembered every night I cried quietly into my pillow, every time he made me feel stupid for asking a simple question, every time he walked past me without acknowledging that I was in the room, every time he spoke to me like I was a stray he regretted feeding. I had convinced myself that staying was strength, that loving him despite everything made me loyal, that endurance was the same thing as commitment. But standing out there in the sharp winter air, I understood the truth. I had been choosing pain because I was afraid of the unknown. I had been choosing captivity because freedom seemed too frightening. I had accepted small pieces of affection like rewards and ignored the ocean of hurt that swallowed me daily. The deeper I walked into the night, the more I began to feel the weight of those years lift from my shoulders, not entirely, not suddenly, but slowly, like peeling off a heavy coat that had been clinging to my skin for too long. I realized that the cold outside was honest. The world out here did not pretend to be warm, it did not lie, it did not smile while hurting me, it simply was, and that truth felt strangely comforting. My breath came out in shaky white clouds, and I could feel my fingers growing numb, yet my mind was waking up in a way it had not done in years. I replayed everything in my head, not with the lens of guilt he had forced on me, but with a new clarity. Why did I stay? Why did I tolerate? Why did I shrink myself to fit into a space that never had room for me to begin with? But the more I thought, the clearer it became. I stayed because I wanted love, and I believed he could give it. I stayed because I was afraid of starting over. I stayed because I kept hoping tomorrow would be better. But that night taught me something vital. Tomorrow never comes when you are with someone who never chooses you. When the door closed behind me, it was not just him shutting me out, it was life pushing me forward, pushing me into a truth I had avoided, pushing me into the possibility of something better. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself, trying to trap what little warmth I had, and I let myself feel everything I had numbed for so long. I felt the betrayal, the exhaustion, the grief of wasted years, the ache of lost hope, and yet beneath all of that was something else, something fragile but unmistakable: freedom. The first taste of it burned like cold air, but it was real, it was mine. My steps grew steadier even as my body shook from the cold, because deep down I knew that night was the beginning, not the end. I was not the woman he had defined. I was not the failure he claimed. I was not the weak figure he wanted me to believe I was. I was a woman who had survived storms and silence, insults and isolation. I was a woman who still had strength in her bones even if she had forgotten it. I was a woman who had been pushed out not because she was worthless but because she was finally meant to walk toward a life that would not dim her light. That thought warmed me more than any coat. Could I rebuild? Yes. Would it hurt? Yes. Was I terrified? Absolutely. But for the first time in years the fear did not defeat me, it fueled me, because anything, even the freezing night, was better than living in a place where love was always conditional and pain was guaranteed. And so I kept walking into the darkness, not knowing what waited for me, but knowing with certainty that whatever it was, it had to be better than the life behind that door. As I walked down that empty street, the darkness felt alive, pressing against my skin with a heaviness I could not ignore, and with every slow step I took I felt pieces of myself rising to the surface, pieces I had buried so deep I almost forgot they existed. The night was silent, yet inside me everything was loud: memories, regrets, fears, truths, all shouting at the same time, as if the darkness itself had grabbed me by the shoulders and forced me to finally look at myself without excuses, without denial, without the comforting lies I had told myself for years. The cold wrapped around me like a second skin, biting into my fingers and burning my lungs with every breath, and it struck me how similar this sensation was to the life I had been living, a life where the pain felt normal, where the chill of loneliness felt familiar, where the sting of rejection felt deserved. I had grown so used to the emotional winter inside that house that standing in the actual physical cold felt almost symbolic, like the world was showing me exactly who I had become, not through words, not through conflict, but through the simple truth of sensation. As I continued walking I could feel the weight of my past pressing on each step I took. I remembered nights when I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong, wondering when the man I married had turned into someone I did not recognize, wondering if maybe I had changed. First I remembered days when I tiptoed around the house, careful not to upset him, careful not to speak too much or too little, careful not to breathe too loudly. I remembered moments when I looked in the mirror and saw a face I did not know anymore, a face drained of joy, drained of color, drained of confidence. And in that darkness, under that flickering streetlight, I finally admitted something I had been afraid to even think. I had lost myself completely. I was no longer the woman who used to laugh at small things, or the woman who dreamed about warm sunsets, or the woman who believed she deserved affection. I had become a shadow shaped by fear, molded by disappointment, and held together by the desperate hope that one day everything would magically become better. Every painful memory rushed back. One time he told me I talked too much, and from that moment on I trained myself to speak less. Another time he told me I was useless, and I spent months trying to overcompensate, doing everything perfectly until I was so exhausted I could barely stand. Another time he said I was too sensitive, and I forced myself to swallow every tear until crying felt like a crime. I remember the day I realized I apologized even when I had done nothing wrong, and the day I realized he never apologized at all. The more I walked, the deeper the truth cut into me. I had not just been living with cruelty, I had adapted to it. I had shaped my entire identity around survival, as if enduring mistreatment was some sort of accomplishment. I wore endurance like armor, not realizing it was actually a chain. I told myself I was strong for staying when really I was scared, frightened of the unknown, frightened of being alone, frightened of starting over with nothing but my own fragile courage. The darkness around me was thick, yet in some strange way it felt honest. It did not pretend to be gentle the way I pretended everything was fine. It did not hide its sharp edges the way I hid my pain. It simply existed boldly, openly, undeniably, and standing in that openness I felt a part of myself slowly waking up, a part that had been asleep for so long I forgot it was there. I started to see myself clearly, not as the broken woman he wanted me to believe I was, but as someone who had endured far beyond what anyone should endure, someone who had sacrificed far too much of her soul, someone who had loved deeply and received only coldness in return. I saw how I had allowed myself to shrink bit by bit, year after year, until one day I woke up and realized I barely existed at all. I saw how every insult, every dismissal, every cold stare had chipped away at my spirit until I became someone who flinched at kindness and froze at conflict. And the darkest part of the night revealed one truth I could no longer run from. I had been living a life where I did not matter. I had allowed myself to believe I was unworthy of tenderness, unworthy of comfort, unworthy of being chosen, not because it was true but because he had repeated it so many times in so many ways that it became the story I told myself. But that night, as I walked alone with my breath fogging in the air and my heart trembling inside my chest, I finally understood that those beliefs were lies crafted by someone who never saw my worth to begin with. The darkness exposed me, but it also freed me from the illusions I had built. I could no longer hide behind excuses. I could no longer pretend things were not that bad. I could no longer convince myself that tomorrow would magically change. A man who had no desire to change. The black sky above me felt endless, stretching far beyond anything I had known, reminding me that there was life outside the small, suffocating world I had been trapped in, reminding me that there were roads I had never walked, dreams I had abandoned, possibilities I had forgotten. Every step forward felt like peeling back layers of old wounds, and each layer hurt but also released something inside me. I replayed arguments where I silenced myself to keep peace, moments when he twisted my words until I doubted my own thoughts, situations where I accepted blame for things I never did. I remembered how isolated I had become, friends slipping away because I stopped reaching out, family sensing something was wrong but hearing me say I was fine over and over because admitting the truth felt too heavy. And in the quiet of that night I asked myself the question I had avoided for years: who am I when I am not trying to please him? Who am I when I am not walking on eggshells? Who am I when I am not being told I am wrong? Who am I when I am not shrinking for someone else? The answers did not come quickly, but the questions themselves felt like the beginning of something powerful, something raw, something real. My body was shaking, partly from the cold and partly because my mind was unlearning years of conditioning. The air felt sharp, but it also felt cleansing, like it was cutting away the fog that had clouded my thoughts for so long. With each deep breath I took, I felt a small spark of strength growing inside me, so faint I barely noticed but powerful enough to pull me forward. The darkness was no longer terrifying, it was revealing. It was a reminder that I had survived every worst moment, I had lived through every silent heartbreak, I had endured every cruel word, I had withstood every lonely night, and if I had survived all of that, I could survive this too. I could survive the cold, the fear, the uncertainty, because unlike the suffering in that house, this pain had purpose. This pain was leading me somewhere. As I kept walking, I realized something monumental. I had been afraid of losing him for so long that I never stopped to see he had already lost me years ago. The moment he stopped treating me with love, the moment he stopped seeing me as a partner, the moment he stopped caring at all, I was not walking away from a home, I was walking away from a prison. And with each step I felt myself returning, piece by piece, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. The night showed me who I had become, yes, but it also whispered who I could become: someone stronger, someone wiser, someone free. When I first heard the low hum of the engine slowing beside me, I felt the cold inside my chest turn into something sharper, something that shot straight through my ribs and made my whole body lock up. I was already shaking from the night air, but this was different. This was the kind of trembling that comes from fear, the kind that wraps itself around your spine and tightens until you can barely breathe. The street had been empty for what felt like forever, and I had convinced myself that loneliness was the worst thing that could find me in the dark. But the moment that black SUV slowed to match my pace, I realized I was wrong. There were worse things than being alone. There were unknown things, dangerous things, frightening things. The headlights washed over me like an accusation, illuminating every mistake, every regret, every tear I had tried to hide from the world, and for a second it felt like the whole night was turning its gaze on me. I could not see who was inside the vehicle, and that made my fear twist even deeper into my bones. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it him? Did he change his mind? Did he come to drag me back inside, not out of love but control? Was it someone who had been watching me? Was it a stranger with cruel intentions, or simply someone lost on the wrong street? I wanted to move faster, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. My breath came out uneven, and I pulled my coat tighter around myself, even though it did nothing to protect me from the icy dread crawling beneath my skin. The SUV crept closer, the engine a steady rhythm that felt too calm, too deliberate, as if whoever was inside had all the time in the world, while I felt like the world was collapsing around me. The window began to lower inch by inch, and with every movement my heart pounded louder and louder. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, like one wrong step could send me falling into a place I was not sure I could survive. I had spent so long living in fear that my body reacted before my mind could process anything. I took a small step back, my hands shaking so hard I could not keep them still. In that moment one thought filled my head: this is it. Whatever is about to happen will decide everything. My life, my safety, my future, all felt suspended in that single breath. Then I heard a voice, and it was nothing like the voice I expected. It was not harsh, it was not threatening, it was not the voice of someone who wished me harm. It was gentle, it was warm, it was steady. A woman leaned slightly toward the open window, her expression soft even under the dim streetlight. She looked at me not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with something I had not felt in a long time, genuine concern. She said, "Are you okay?" and those simple words hit me harder than the cold ever could. For a moment I could not speak, my throat tightened and my lips felt frozen, not from the night air but from the shock of hearing kindness after so many years without it. She repeated herself, this time even softer, "Honey, are you all right? Do you need help?" And that was the moment I felt my entire body begin to unravel, because no one had asked me that in so long. No one had looked at me with genuine care. No one had taken the time to see past the mask I wore every day just to survive. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, something raw, something aching, something that had been trapped inside me for years. My first instinct was to lie, to protect myself, to protect the fragile shell of control I had left. I wanted to say, "Yes, I am fine." I wanted to say, "I do not need anything." I wanted to say, "Please leave," because I had been taught to hide my pain, taught to hide my truth, taught to act strong even when I was breaking. But my body betrayed me. My teeth were chattering too hard, my breath was too shaky, my voice too lost. The truth slipped out through trembling lips before I could stop it. No, I am not okay. The moment those words left my mouth, it felt like something inside me cracked open, something old, something buried, something that had been covered in silence for far too long. I felt a rush of emotion tearing through me, fear, relief, shame, exhaustion, all tangled together in a way I could not separate. She nodded slowly, like she understood everything I was not saying, and she gestured toward the passenger door, telling me to get in so I could warm up, telling me she would not drive away until she knew I was safe, telling me she was not here to harm me. But my fear did not disappear instantly. It hovered like a dark cloud, reminding me of all the times I had trusted the wrong person, all the times I had hoped for kindness and received pain. Instead I hesitated, my feet refused to move, and my heartbeat hammered so loudly it felt like it echoed through the entire street. I looked at her more closely, trying to read her face, trying to find any sign that this was a trap, but all I saw was sincerity. She was around my mother's age, maybe older, with lines on her face that spoke of experience and eyes that glowed with empathy rather than danger. She was bundled in a thick coat and her hair was pulled back neatly. She had a calm presence, the kind that quiets storms, the kind that draws warmth into cold spaces. Still my instinct screamed at me, "You do not know her, you do not know what she wants, you do not know if stepping into that car will save you or destroy you." But then she reached over and turned off the engine, a small gesture, but one that told me she was not trying to lure me anywhere. She was not trying to chase me. She was trying to show me that I had control, that I could walk away if I wanted to, that the decision was mine. No one had given me a choice in a long time. I lived in a world where my voice barely mattered, where my decisions were mocked, where my needs were ignored, where my safety depended on someone else's shifting mood. But this woman, this stranger, was giving me something I had not received in years: autonomy. She was giving me the chance to choose my own next step. And for a moment I felt a tremor of strength inside me, a faint flicker of courage shaking off the dust of years spent living in fear. I took one small step toward the SUV, my breath coming out in shallow clouds. I studied the woman again, and something inside me whispered, "She is not here to hurt you." The cold was biting harder now, my fingers stiff, my face numb, my legs trembling uncontrollably. My body felt like it was being pushed toward her by the night itself, by the exhaustion, by the years of silence and struggle, by the desperate need for even a moment of warmth, even a moment of safety. She watched me with patience, not rushing me, not pressuring me, not expecting anything, and that alone made my breath hitch, because I had been living with someone who demanded everything and offered nothing. When I finally reached the door, she leaned back, giving me space, showing me she respected whatever decision I made. I opened the door slowly, the warm air spilling out, hitting my face like a wave of mercy, and for the first time that night I felt the smallest flicker of hope, something fragile, something trembling, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. As I slid into the seat, the warmth wrapped around me like a gentle embrace, and I let out a shaky breath, as if my body finally realized it was safe, safe enough to feel, safe enough to tremble, safe enough to breathe. And I knew in that instant that the moment that SUV slowed beside me was not another threat, it was the beginning of something else, something unexpected, something life-changing, something that would rewrite the story of that night and every night after. When I settled into the passenger seat, the first thing I felt was warmth, real physical warmth pouring from the vents and soaking into my frozen skin, but there was another kind of warmth too, a softer one, something I had not felt in so long that at first I did not recognize it. It was the warmth of human kindness, the warmth that comes from being seen, the warmth that comes when someone looks at you not as a burden, not as a nuisance, not as a problem to be managed, but as a human being who deserves care. My body was still shaking uncontrollably, and I tried to hide it by pulling the blanket closer, but the woman beside me noticed anyway. She reached into the backseat and handed me a thick blanket, her movements gentle, her voice even gentler as she said, "Here, sweetheart, wrap yourself up." The blanket felt heavy, like comfort should feel, and when I draped it across my lap I almost choked on the sudden rush of emotion, because no one had offered me comfort in so long. I had forgotten what it felt like, I had forgotten what it meant. She did not bombard me with questions, she did not demand explanations, she did not force me to talk, she simply turned the heat up and adjusted the vents so the warmth would reach me faster. Then she sat quietly, giving me space to gather myself, giving me permission to breathe. At first that silence felt strange because I was used to silence that felt like punishment, silence that crackled with tension, silence that meant anger was building just beyond the surface, but this silence was different. It was gentle, it was safe, it wrapped around me in a way that made me feel like I was allowed to exist without defending myself. My body slowly began to thaw, and with each degree of warmth I could feel the tension inside me loosening just enough to let my mind settle. My hands hurt painfully as the heat reached them, the way fingers sting when they have been freezing too long, but even that pain felt like a sign of life, a reminder that I was still here, I was still surviving. I had not been destroyed by the cold outside or the cold I had lived with for so many years. The woman glanced at me occasionally, not in a way that made me feel watched, but in a way that made me feel cared for, and every time I met her eyes there was something steady there, something reassuring, something I had never expected to find in a stranger. I felt so raw, so breakable, that even her kindness felt overwhelming, and I blinked hard, trying to hold back tears. "It is okay," she said softly, "you are safe here with me." But those words felt almost foreign to my ears. I had heard the opposite for so long that my mind struggled to accept them. I did not feel safe in my own home. I did not feel safe around the man who promised to protect me. I did not feel safe in the life I had built around him. But here, in a stranger's car, wrapped in a blanket with warm air brushing against my face, something inside me finally unclenched. She started driving slowly, not fast, not abruptly, just steadily, as if she did not want to startle me. The soft hum of the engine felt like a lullaby compared to the shouting, the slamming, the tension that usually filled my nights. The road was nearly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, and for the first time in hours I let myself lean back against the seat. After a few minutes she spoke again, her voice still calm. "I will not ask you anything you do not want to tell me. I just want to make sure you are warm and safe, okay?" That level of consideration felt almost unreal. I had grown so used to being interrogated, so used to being blamed, so used to having my feelings dismissed, that the idea of someone respecting my boundaries felt like a luxury I had never earned. I nodded, a small motion because I still did not trust my voice. She must have sensed that because she did not push, she simply kept driving, letting the warmth fill the space between us. She turned on the heated seats, and when the warmth spread beneath me I felt a lump in my throat. I wanted to tell her thank you, but the words felt too small, too weak compared to what she was giving me. The minutes stretched, and with each one I felt myself relax just a little bit more. I had been holding myself together by sheer force for so long that my body did not remember how to let go, but the kindness in that car gently coaxed me toward a kind of release I had not experienced in years. My shoulders slid down from the tense height they usually sat at. My breathing began to even out, the shaking slowly eased, and I could feel my mind clearing as if fog was lifting from a long dark valley. As the warmth seeped deeper into my bones, memories began to rise, memories I had pushed away, memories I had survived by pretending did not exist, moments of me sitting at the kitchen table feeling invisible, moments of me waiting for him to come home not knowing what version of him I would face, moments of me bracing for arguments that always erupted out of nowhere, moments of me whispering apologies for things I never did. And now here I was in a quiet car with a stranger whose presence felt more comforting than any moment I had ever shared with my husband. The contrast was staggering, and the realization crashed into me with a kind of force that took my breath away. Kindness should not feel shocking, but it did, because I had been living in a world where cruelty felt normal and tenderness felt like myth. She did not interrupt my thoughts, she did not rush me, she simply let me exist, and for someone like me that was one of the greatest gifts I could receive. After a while she said, I know a place where you can stay tonight, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, would you like me to take you there? She spoke carefully, leaving the choice entirely in my hands, as if she understood how important it was for me to choose something for myself for once. I swallowed hard, nodding again. My throat felt tight, but this time it was from gratitude, not fear. She smiled, a small quiet smile, one that felt more sincere than anything I had seen in a very long time. The car turned onto a main road, the city lights growing brighter, and with every passing moment I could feel myself returning from the edge. The warmth, the blanket, the patient silence all worked together to rebuild pieces of me that had been shattered slowly over years of neglect. For the first time since I stepped out into the freezing air, I felt a hint of strength, a tiny flame flickering inside my chest, the kind of strength that comes when someone finally treats you like you matter, the kind of strength that reminds you you are not invisible, you are not alone, you are not undeserving of care. She glanced at me again, and this time she said something that broke something open inside me, something tender, something vulnerable. You did not deserve to be out in that cold, honey, nobody deserves that. And I felt tears fill my eyes, not because of the pain but because of the truth in her voice. She said it so confidently, so naturally, so compassionately that I could not help believing her. The warmth of her kindness seeped into the coldest part of my heart, thawing wounds I did not even realize were still bleeding. And as she drove through the night, guiding me toward safety, toward possibility, I realized something profound. The world outside my husband's door was not as cruel as I feared. In fact, in the span of a few minutes it had shown me more kindness than he had shown me in years. And in that car, wrapped in a blanket held in softness, I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe. Healing does not always begin with the people you expect. Sometimes it begins with a stranger who does the one thing you were starved for, someone who sees you, someone who cares, someone who helps you breathe again. The moment I walked into that silent house, I felt something inside me twist, because everything looked familiar yet nothing felt like home anymore, and I knew I could not stay trapped in the memory of what he had done, because the walls carried echoes of arguments and slammed doors, and I realized that a woman who had been thrown into the cold should never have to return to the ice again. I moved through each room slowly, like someone revisiting a life that no longer belonged to her, and I touched the kitchen counter where I had once prepared meals, believing I was feeding love, but now I knew I had been feeding someone who only took from me until there was almost nothing left. I remembered mornings when I stood here humming softly, thinking the world was stable, only to learn that stability can collapse in a single night when the person you trust decides that your worth is disposable. I walked to the living room and my chest tightened, because I still remembered the night he shoved me toward the door with no hesitation and no mercy, and how the cold swallowed me whole, as if nature itself knew I had been cast out. Standing here now, I wondered how my heart had survived that moment, because I could still feel the sting of betrayal, like a hand around my throat refusing to let go. I sat down slowly and felt the weight of everything I had carried alone for far too long, and I whispered to myself that surviving is not the same as living, and living requires courage I had not known I possessed until life forced me to find it. I felt a rising determination in my chest, because I knew I could not let that night define who I would become. Pain had tried to shape me, but I was not going to let it carve away the parts of me that still believed in hope and new beginnings. I stood up and looked around the room that once held memories of forced smiles and quiet heartbreaks, and I made a silent promise that this house would no longer be a graveyard of my spirit. I walked to the doorway and pressed my hand against the wall one last time, and I felt an odd mix of grief and relief, because I finally understood that closure is not a moment but a decision. I stepped outside and breathed in the crisp air, and I felt something shift deep within me, like a locked door finally clicking open. The world looked different, brighter, almost as if it was waiting for me to reclaim my place in it. As I stood there, I realized that the black SUV that stopped for me that night had not just saved me from the cold, it had awakened a strength I had forgotten I carried. That stranger who opened the door and offered warmth had shown me in one simple act that kindness still existed in a world that had recently felt merciless. I walked toward the small suitcase I had packed earlier, and the weight of it felt symbolic, because it held only what I truly needed and nothing that tied me to the life I had escaped. There was power in leaving behind everything that had been used to diminish me. There was freedom in choosing myself after years of choosing someone who never bothered to choose me. Back. I looked toward the gate and felt the sun warm the side of my face, and for the first time in months I felt like the world was not pressing down on my shoulders but lifting me up. As I made my way down the steps I thought about the future, and it no longer looked like a dark hallway with no exit. Instead it looked open, wide, inviting, and full of possibilities I had once been too scared to imagine. I remembered all the moments I silenced my voice to keep peace, all the times I swallowed pain to avoid conflict, all the ways I made myself small so he could feel big. And now I could see all those sacrifices laid out before me like stepping stones leading to this moment when I finally decided that my own heart deserved protection too. I reached the end of the driveway and stopped because memories came rushing in, but this time they did not pull me under. They passed through me like wind, carrying away the heaviness I had held for so long. I could feel a quiet power growing inside me because I understood something important now. Healing does not start when someone apologizes, because sometimes the apology never comes. Healing begins the moment you decide that your life matters, even if someone else tried to make you believe it did not. I started walking slowly, letting each step remind me that I was moving forward, not backward. The sound of birds and distant traffic blended together, and for the first time these ordinary noises felt comforting, like the soundtrack of a life I was ready to build for myself. I thought about the stranger in the SUV and how his voice had been steady and warm that night, and how he had wrapped a blanket around me as if my shivering mattered. That moment had cracked open a belief I had forgotten, that not everyone sees you as disposable. Some people actually care. Some people see your humanity even when you feel invisible. A soft wind brushed against my arms and I pulled my jacket closer, realizing that even though the night he threw me out had been brutal, it had also marked the beginning of my awakening. I realized that being broken open can be the first step toward being rebuilt stronger. I kept walking and thought about how many times I had tried to fix a marriage that was already splintered beyond repair, and how many nights I cried in silence hoping he would notice, but he never did. And yet here I was standing strong, breathing deeply, choosing myself in a way I never had before. As I continued on the path, I felt my heart shed the fear that had held it captive. I imagined all the women who had stood where I stood, afraid, alone, unsure, and I wished I could gather them all in one room and tell them with unwavering certainty that they are stronger than the pain they survived. That they deserve warmth and safety and love that does not bruise or belittle but lifts and protects. I reached a small bench near the sidewalk and sat down, letting the sunlight wash over me. I closed my eyes and let myself feel the reality of this new beginning. There was still healing to do, still nights ahead when memories might sting, still moments when doubt might whisper in my ear. But unlike before, I knew I would face those moments with a heart that had learned how to fight. With a spine that had learned how to stand tall. With a soul that refused to shrink ever again. I opened my eyes and looked across the street at people walking by, living their everyday lives, and I realized that my own life was waiting for me too. Not behind me, not inside that house, but ahead of me in every step I had yet to take. I stood up feeling steady and clear, and as I picked up my suitcase I whispered to myself, "You survived, now you rise." And with that I began walking toward a future I finally believed I deserved. When I finally reached the place where my new life waited for me, I realized that the journey was not just about leaving behind a house or a marriage or a man who had thrown me away, but about stepping into a version of myself I had not seen in years, and maybe had never seen at all. I stood still for a long moment because my heart needed time to understand that this peace I felt was real, and that the fear I had carried for so long was slowly beginning to loosen its grip. The world looked different now, because instead of seeing threats in every shadow I was starting to see possibilities in the open spaces before me. I felt an unfamiliar sense of safety rise inside me, and I held on to it like someone gripping the edge of a lifeline, because I knew how rare it was after all I had endured. I walked forward slowly, letting my steps sink into the ground as if I were grounding myself in a life I was finally choosing instead of one I had been forced to survive. I thought about the woman I had been before that night, the woman who cried quietly so no one would hear, the woman who apologized even when she had done nothing wrong, the woman who believed love meant enduring everything, even disrespect, even cruelty, even being pushed into the cold. As I walked I felt that version of me fade like a shadow dissolving in the morning light, and in her place rose a woman who refused to be ignored or silenced or diminished ever again. I felt the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, and it reminded me that I was alive, and that being alive meant more than just existing inside pain. I reached a small grassy area near a quiet street and sat down because something inside me wanted to breathe without rushing, without fear, without bracing for impact. I closed my eyes and listened to the natural sounds around me, the wind brushing the leaves, the soft hum of life moving at its own pace, the footsteps of strangers passing at a distance. All of it felt gentle and real, and I realized I had forgotten what gentleness felt like. I had lived so long expecting the next harsh word or the next cold stare or the next moment when I would be made to feel small that my body had learned survival like a habit. But now it was learning something new. It was learning calm. It was learning hope. It was learning that I was allowed to rest. I let my mind drift back to the black SUV, the warmth of that moment, the shock of someone noticing me when the man who vowed to love me had chosen instead to discard me. That memory stayed with me not because of the rescue alone, but because it reminded me of something I feared I had lost: a belief that kindness still existed in the world. The driver had not known my story, and yet he had opened his door and offered comfort, expecting nothing in return. It made me realize that brokenness is not the end, because there are people whose light can guide you through the darkness even if they have no idea how much they are helping. As I sat in that quiet place, I began to understand that healing is rarely loud. It does not arrive like a dramatic announcement. It comes softly, through small choices, through moments of courage, through the decision to take one more step even when the path is unclear. Healing was the moment I stood up from the bench and believed that my future was worth fighting for. Healing was the moment I carried my suitcase down the street instead of collapsing under the weight of memories. Healing was the moment I realized that the cold night he pushed me out was not the end of my story, it was the beginning of the chapter where I finally chose myself. My thoughts drifted to the life I would build from this point forward, and though the future felt wide and unpredictable, it did not scare me anymore. I imagined waking up in a new place where the silence did not carry tension, where the walls did not remember arguments, where the door was opened by my own choice, not slammed in my face. I imagined learning new routines, simple comforting ones that belonged only to me. I imagined finding work or friends or purpose that made me feel valuable again, not because someone else approved of me but because I approved of myself. I imagined planting new roots in soil that was not poisoned by cruelty. I stood up again, feeling stronger than when I sat down, and I knew the past would not disappear, but it no longer had the same power over me. The memory of him pushing me out into the freezing night still existed, but now instead of tearing me apart, it reminded me of who I never wanted to be again and where I never wanted to stay again. It reminded me that survival had shaped me in a way that made me braver than I ever realized. I had walked through pain that tried to swallow me whole, and I had emerged still standing, still breathing, still capable of loving myself. As I continued walking, the sky began to shift into soft shades of gold and rose as the sun started to descend, and something in that warm light made my heart expand with quiet gratitude. Not gratitude for what I had endured, but gratitude for the strength I discovered because of it. Gratitude for the moment I realized that being thrown away was not the same as being worthless. Gratitude for the stranger who reminded me that compassion still lived in the world. Gratitude for the courage that had been buried inside me, waiting for the right moment to rise. I made my way farther down the street and saw a small cafe with gentle lighting spilling out from its windows, and something in that soft glow made me pause. It felt welcoming in a way I could not explain, and I walked toward it almost without thinking. Inside, I found a seat in the corner and wrapped my hands around a warm cup of tea, and the heat sinking into my fingers made me feel more grounded, more present. I watched people moving around, chatting, laughing, working, and it struck me that the world had continued on even while I suffered behind closed doors. And now I was part of that world again, not hidden, not silenced, not afraid. As I sipped the warm tea, I began to imagine who I wanted to become from this moment forward. Not the woman shaped by fear, but the woman shaped by resilience. Not the woman defined by abandonment, but the woman defined by rising. I saw myself learning new skills, meeting new people, creating a life that honored the parts of me that had been neglected for so long. I saw myself building a future that held joy and softness and adventure. And I knew deep down that I would never again allow anyone to strip me of my dignity or throw me into the cold or make me question my worth. When I finished my tea, I stepped outside again, and the air felt different this time, not freezing, not threatening, but fresh and filled with possibility. I tightened my grip on my suitcase and began walking toward wherever this new journey would lead me, and with each step I felt the weight of the past grow lighter. I whispered to myself a truth I finally believed: you deserved better, and now you will have better. The world stretched open before me, and for the first time in a long time I walked into it not as a woman broken but as a woman reborn.